very much. I think it's if this is on or Mary is.
It is on.
Is it
Yeah,
on?
yeah.
Okay, great, it is.
I would give this for the captain here is an audience. Anne is also a proud AOPI, so those AOPIs in the audience who are here or will be coming. That's an important thing. Also, because I'm a mother, we would be remiss not to say that you have 3 grown children.
I do.
And a granddaughter.
And a granddaughter, that's right. My children grew up with the cake mix doctor, and now they're grown. So it has been a lifetime, really, of writing about food, and fascinating how over the years, what you're interested in writing about changes.
So you started off in the kitchen with your mother. You talked about that. What prompted the transition, your love of cooking to the love of writing about cooking and food? How did that happen?
Well, I didn't plan it for sure. I was the editor of my high school newspaper. So I've always been a newspaper journalist. And from there, went to the University of Georgia. Sorry. And that's where, I studied all kinds of writing, but I also took courses in foods and nutrition and other things that I had never been exposed to, in Nashville. And it was fascinating. And I had clips from working for the local paper, the Nashville Banner, which is the afternoon paper in Nashville. Every summer, every Christmas that I was home from college, I would intern at the newspaper. I just loved it. In fact, I was the only reporter in the building on a Sunday night in August 1976. We talked about this before, when Elvis died.
Oh, wow.
Elvis died. 77. And I remember the managing editor, city editor, looking at me and going, who else is here to cover this story? And it was just the college intern, but it was fantastic, and I got to go out and interview people all over Nashville. But that clip, writing about Elvis's death, got me my job in Atlanta, because when I interviewed for the job, they didn't care that I had never written about food. They just wanted me to be able to write about breaking news. And there you go. So I learned to write food on the job. Yeah.
That's awesome. One of the things, this cookbook, if you have not bought your copy, you will see it and flip through it, is beautiful. And it is different than a lot of other cookbooks that I've seen. And being part of the SFA, we see cookbooks all the time. Can you talk a little bit? The book opens with sort of a regional history, more than just I love to cook with my grandmother, but also a history of the South. Can you talk a little bit about that and why you decided to open the cookbook with the history of the region? Because that is unique.
Right. Well, I set out to write a book on Southern baking. And once I was testing recipes and collecting, I fell in love with every topic and would stay up late at night and research people I've never heard of before and read old obituaries. And I was just drawn to these places in the South that even as a lifelong Southerner, I didn't know about. And pies from Arkansas, I had never heard of. Cherry nut pie and possum pie and all this. And so I really fell in love with the people and their recipes. And so all of a sudden, this book is becoming not just recipes, it's about Southern culture. And I think at the same time, for the past 3 years, kind of post-pandemic, working on it, it just felt right to dive into the South as a culture and to look at baking, through the people and the land of the South. And that's why it evolved into what it is today.
And when we were talking on the phone, we had discussed a little bit about the regional differences in Southern cooking. And of course, the Southern Foodways Alliance studies Southern culture in the regions. Can you talk to us a little bit about what regional differences that you found? Cakes in the mountains, cakes on the coast.
Definitely. I mean, state by state, so the book contains recipes from 14 states, from Texas all the way up to Maryland. I'm very generous. It's a wide net. But I didn't find, it's interesting, I found more regional differences within certain areas, like little micro areas, as opposed to state. Because, for example, lane cake, which is very popular, in southwest Georgia and southeastern Alabama, that's more of a regional cake, I think. It's Alabama state cake, but it's also Jimmy Carter's favorite cake. Mm-hmm. So there you go. Yes, so the mountains, the farmland, the coast, the coastal cities, Charleston and New Orleans, were like metropolises all their own. I mean, the people that came into those cities was so broad and so worldly that the flavors that came out of Charleston, and then the religious differences in the South, where people settled and what if they did, come over for religious reasons, especially Jewish settlers in the South, brought just so many baking recipes because in Eastern Europe and Germany and parts of Spain, they baked. Their ancestors baked. So it was already a part of their culture and a part of their holidays. So I think it was fascinating, not so much state by state, but sort of region by region, and then looking at the land and the people who lived there on how they affected a recipe.
When you look through this book, I'm not going to say flip because you can't flip through this book. There are thousands of recipes for chocolate cake, probably 10 times that many for coconut cake. So can you tell us a little bit about your process for choosing DeLester Miles, for example, to feature her coconut cake? DeLester is a cook who worked for Frank's Stitt in Birmingham. She's won awards. She's been featured in magazines. Like how did you choose her coconut cake versus how did you choose someone else's chocolate cake? What was your methodology for doing that?
Well, pretty much what she said. There are so many coconut cakes, so many chocolate cakes. To me, the two coconut cakes that I included in the book had to be pretty spectacular. And one of them had to be over the top. And that's DeLester Miles. That's hers. It's with pecans. It requires a simple syrup. You've got a filling between the layers. It's fabulous. You're not going to make it every day or every weekend, but you might make it for a special occasion. And then the coconut snowballs, I could only put in so many recipes, and so I chose to sort of riff on the coconut cake that we know with cupcakes, coconut snowballs, and then kind of channel the Eudora Welty and Delta Wedding for that recipe. You're right. There's so many ways. And with chocolate cake, I chose a recipe that was completely off my radar. A recipe from the early 1900s, Louisville, an early black home economist named Athaline Payton. And I read about her in some old Kentucky cookbooks. And what I thought was remarkable about that was that she created a chocolate layer cake in the early 1900s at a time when not a lot of people in the South were baking with chocolate. It was very new. It was very fresh. It was happening in the Northeast, but not in the South. And the amount of chocolate that people were putting in a cake and calling it chocolate would never pass muster today is far too faint. So I did take a little artistic license with her recipe and cranked up the chocolate a little bit to make it even more delicious. But so it's not just recipes. I was mindful of the culture. I was mindful of people, past and present, and then geographically, how was I going to, be fair and include a representative sample.
A lot of people have come to talks here at Offspring and likely know the process of creating a cookbook, but can you really dive deep? Because it's not just finding a recipe and handing it to a publisher. There's testing, there's photography. Can you talk about that process from A to Z? I find it fascinating as a person who's never written a cookbook.
Right. So you got a recipe, and with this book, every recipe has a story. So I had to research the story behind the recipe, find the people, whether I could find, their living relatives, or if I just had to go back and find a copy of their cookbook. So working with archives, digital cookbooks. We have a fabulous archive of old cookbooks in Nashville was donated to the Vanderbilt Medical School by actually was a former home economist in Alabama, and they tried to get rid of her. They tried to fire her, and she got mad, and she had a friend in Vanderbilt, and he said, "Come on up here, bring all those cookbooks with you." And they med school hired Neige Todd-Hunter as their nutritionist for the medical school, probably back in the 1950s. And she came with books in tow and then left all of those books to Vanderbilt. So for somebody like me who's in Nashville, wow. I mean, you're talking about books from the 1800s. It's fantastic. So the research behind the recipes, the story, developing that. And then I had a lot of them, if they were old recipes, I had to get archival photos to go with them. I didn't take a course in that. And that was a little close to deadline, too. So I actually had to hire someone to help me because not all photos, for example, with the Library of Congress, are public domain. And knowing which ones are public domain so that I wouldn't get in legal trouble. The presidential libraries are terrific. They want to promote the president. They will, as long with proper accreditation, they will let you use most anything. There are different collections across the Southeast. Natalie Dupree's papers have been donated to the University of South Carolina and Columbia. So I just had fabulous photos to choose from of Natalie. But it's finding all of that. It really was finding it. And then, for example, Minnie Pearl, to get a photo of Minnie Pearl for her cornbread recipe, I had to pay for that because the photographer who took that photo of Sarah Canna and as Minnie Pearl, that was a gift that it was in an estate that was given to the Country Music Hall of Fame. So any photos from that estate have to be compensated for. It was unbelievable. And then there's the kitchen, right? This is a cookbook. So, we did test, and I say we, I have worked with a woman in Nashville for about 18 years, Martha Bowden, and I always shout out to Martha in my books. But her family's from the Northeast, and we've been a good team because she asks questions about Southern recipes that, I think everybody knows, and she doesn't know. So Martha and I would test the recipes, and I test them in my kitchen, and she tests them in hers. And then we retest, cross again. Some recipes, after 3 tests, they're good to go. I tend to type recipes in the early morning. I'll have a stack ready to type that we've just freshly tested because then I remember it. Never type recipes late at night. And that's kind of the process. But I will say that, with so many recipes in the book and so many we had to cut, every recipe had to be fabulous. I mean, that was kind of that was the last question. Is it fabulous? Does it, or as some authors say, is it book worthy? Yeah, I like that.
I like it too. Mm-hmm. Is there one recipe that sticks out in your mind as something you found and you've never heard of, and you tested it, and you're like, this is going to be part of my repertoire?
Wow.
And it doesn't have to be your favorite. It could be top 5. Like,
Well, so many. I think the first recipe in the book is a great example. I had never heard of batty cakes, B-A-T-T-Y, little corn griddle cakes. That's a North Alabama recipe from Florence. And I love the story behind that recipe on how a woman named Nina Kane had worked for a family in North Alabama all her life as a cook. And her ancestors had been, going on back, had been enslaved on the cotton plantations of that area. And Curtis Flowers was the woman who gave me the recipe, and she turned in, at the insistence of Alex Haley, the late novelist Alex Haley, who was also, his people were from that area in Alabama. She turned in all the names of the enslaved enslaved who had been owned by her great-great-great-grandfather to the library and to the court, so that anyone who believes that their people came from that area could at least go back and do some researching. So then there's this batty cake, which Nina Kane made all her life, but they never had a recipe for. And they missed it. And so with the ingredients, telling me the ingredients, I tried to work out what I thought were batty cakes, back and forth. And it became a tribute to Nina Kane, and at least tells her story. So that's a long answer to one recipe that I had never heard of. And then there were crazy recipes like cantaloupe cream pie from Arkansas, which is an old railroad recipe, because cooks on railroads would need to use up whatever produce and whatever ingredients were put onto the railroad car, and because they couldn't take it on with them. And so there's only so much, melon you can slice for breakfast. And he figured out a way to make a pie, a meringue pie out of the cantaloupe.
You talked a little bit about how she donated the papers from North Alabama. Can we talk a little bit about how Southern recipes were shared in the days before the modern press is printing one of these lovely hardback editions? How are people sharing those recipes?
I think a lot of people kept them in their head. They didn't share them. Number one, they didn't share them. And because that was their recipe, they were proud of it, and the recipe was properly monetized. I mean, there are a lot of people who've created businesses, a lot of women who've created businesses out of the home, and have made a particular pound cake, tea cake, and people pay good money for it. So they're not going to share a recipe, understandably, but then I'd say in family diaries, word of mouth, and community cookbooks. And that was, something I think is very much a part of the South. But community cookbooks came out of after the Civil War. There were charitable cookbooks that were, printed to raise money as relief. And a lot of the recipes that have been in people's minds, in diaries, were put into these charitable cookbooks. And those were, I believe, that they preserved a style of Southern baking. And had they not been printed, and had people not wanted to raise money to help others, we would not have a lot of the 19th century recipes like egg custard pie, pound cake, that we do today. And so it was through, really, cookbooks have just been amazing, be a way to preserve recipes. But people have not necessarily been credited in cookbooks, and who took credit for a recipe was not always truthful. And I think that women were known by their husband's initials, and up until about 1920, with the right to vote, and black cooks were not given credit for the recipes.
So this is a question I want to ask you, and then maybe throw it out, so put your thinking caps on. I have never seen a book called Baking in Southern California, or Baking in Northern Montana, or Baking in the Midwest, for that matter. Why do you think baking in the South is a unique thing? What makes it so special and revered?
I could say it's the land and the people. It is that unique combination of the people that have lived in the South and all that they bring. And the land is unique. But I think it's one more item. The South has always held a mystique, and people who don't live in the South have always been curious about the South. And whether it's because we are who we are, or they vacation in the South, or their children go to school in the South, there's just always been something about the South that has made the rest of the country really curious. And I do think that that's why this book is getting a lot of attention, because I write really honestly about the that I love the South. It is my home, but it is not perfect. It is still complicated. And both slavery and sugar have been the two greatest factors in Southern baking. And they're really horrible subjects to even consider today, but they have been the building blocks of Southern baking. And I think we have to acknowledge that and give credit where credit is due.
Anybody out there have another take or thought on why? I'm not gonna call on you. I'd love to know.
Actually, I'm happy to share. I'm actually from California, and my son went to school here, and I'm here half the time now. They're trying to get rid of me now. But one of the first times I went to someone's house, she said, "Oh, I got a strawberry cake." And I said, "What's a strawberry cake?" Like, I'd never had a strawberry cake. And then I was obsessed for like a month and ate literally my body weight in strawberry cake because it was something I'd never had.
Yeah.
And I find myself discovering so much about the South and the culture of the South because my son played a sport, so I've traveled around, and there's not just this huge assortment of delicious, wonderful things, but a desire to share them with people. And so a lot of my experience of learning to be in the South and be a part of the South in my own way as a guest and as, hopefully a community member is experiencing all those things.
Right.
And it's what I love about being here.
So a generosity of spirit.
A sharing, an enthusiasm for sharing something unique to here, unique to place, or unique to family.
It's great.
I think there's a showmanship in recipes between towns and between, you can think about even back on the plantation days where somebody would go and they'd get their cooks to whip up something really spectacular for everybody else to see. Look what we have here, so you've got cultures that are very much posturing, that are immigrating to the South, that are trying to assert their betterment of others just on a societal level or a social level, and they're using the right things that they're getting from the land. They're using the abundance of sugar, which is so close to the South, and there's we have 2 growing seasons. You can garden, you can grow 2 full gardens in the South, and so there's always an abundance of regional things coming in, and this excitement of, well, what's coming from far off? Everything in the South feels far off because you have to travel so far to go. It's 45 minutes to a party.
Delta dining.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's some really good points as well. And baking has always been revered. Someone who can bake.
It's magic.
It is. It's a mixture, I believe, of science and creativity. It's figuring it out, but it's also loving what you do and wanting to make it beautiful. And it's very creative. My mother did not know how to cook when she got married, and she taught herself to bake. But people will tell me, I remember how lovely everything your mother made was. And she had sisters who painted. And I really believed that it was an artistic side of her. It was just making beautiful, beautiful food. But being able to do it was worth something, and it's something you didn't want to share and brag about.
I think also too, 2 things. I think in the South we really emphasize being friendly and wanting reasons to get together, and that's probably one of them. But it's also something that you don't have to have a lot of money to be able to entertain people by cooking for them. And so it would be something that every socioeconomic group could engage in. It wouldn't have to be like you'd have to have a lot of money to put on a party, you just have a barbecue or something, and everybody brings something, but it's something everybody can participate in.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the first chapter in this book is cornbread, because I say cornbread fed people. It fed people, and anybody could make it because corn grew everywhere in the South. It It wasn't like wheat, which was more precious. Rolls were for Sunday, white biscuits Sunday. But you're right. I mean, and interviewing some of the mountain cooks was interesting too, on how the emphasis there was to scrimp and save for that ingredients to bake a cake to take to church. Yeah.
Lynn?
So, Anne, I'm just starting to think about all the community cookbooks that you've gone through and all the testing and everything. Just now I'm starting to feel sort of overwhelmed myself. But how long? You know, I know all the testing and writing the cookbook must have taken a great deal of time. But what about doing all the research and going out and meeting people? And you said you interviewed the people in Appalachia, and so you just
a lot of that was done
traveled?
via phone on that. And I found out about some of them when I was driving to Connecticut to see my daughter, you know, and listening to regional Appalachian radio in West Virginia. It was right after, you know, the pandemic was still going on when I started this project, so I certainly went to the Delta. I went to Georgia. I went certain places with the photographer, but a lot of it was done on the phone and Zoom.
Well, I'm sure you brought a lot of you've had so much experience over the years that probably helped you too, bringing that with you.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think I could have written this book had I not been a newspaper reporter. You know, I knew how to boil it down and get 5 questions I needed to know. I knew where to find. I knew how to attribute. I knew how to, I knew what it meant to have real sources. So I don't know. I think it's almost like a different kind of brain. It's really, in some respects, it's a cookbook, but it's a research project too. Yeah, as well.
Yeah, it's a cultural study. Like it really is a
Yes,
cultural
what
study.
you all do.
That's what Anne Marie does, yes. She's my colleague at the SFA who does our oral history work. Ed has interviewed Anne, so if anybody's interested in seeing an oral history with Anne, you can check that out at southernfoodways.org. There's my phone. Do we have any other questions? Yes.
I had an experience a couple of years ago that I've never had before. I was in a Faulkner book group, and so we had a party, and we were supposed to try to bring things that would be, of that time period or representative.
Right.
So I had this cookbook that came out in Oxford in the early 80s, late 70s, and it was basically about all the different antebellum homes and recipes that were from the families that lived in those homes. Well, this one recipe I decided to try to make was a recipe that had been one of the ancestors of Faulkner, like his great-great-grandmother or something. It had no measurements, and it did not tell you how to bake it.
What was it for? What
It was like a pound cake sort of thing. So I just put it all together and put it in the oven, and I thought, maybe they didn't even have ovens. Maybe they just put it on the wood stove or something. It was very heavy.
Yeah.
But it didn't taste really bad. But I didn't know. Have you
Slice it and serve it
What
with
is
lemon
it?
curd.
What are you supposed to do when you find a recipe that that assumes that everybody who was reading it knew what to do?
I think not so much this book, but in a previous book, American Cake, I did find a recipe just like that, and it was in an old South Carolina diary. And it was just eggs and sugar and water and flour. And I thought, what in the heck? How could this make a cake? And then I realized, wait a minute. This is so old that the sugar wasn't granulated. It was in a cone. So they probably broke some of that off, and then they put it in the water, put that on the back of the stove, made a sugar syrup. What do you do when you've got your eggs and egg whites, and then flour at the end? It was a sponge cake. And and I called it water cake. Harriet Orie's water cake. And it was, and there were a lot of cakes of that period called water cake. Because that's was an integral part of the recipe. So I don't know. I think it's kind of fun in a way. I mean, it is. It's a little, can be a waste of ingredients. But yeah.
Oh, I took a backup dessert.
Very good.
One last sort of off the wall question. When you are doing your research and you're finding recipes that are handwritten, which are my very favorite recipes, in my family the best ones are usually written on like the back of an envelope,
Oh, yeah.
junk mail envelope. What is the strangest thing you found a recipe written on in your research, whether for this book or another?
Well, it's got to be Rosa Parks' pancake recipe that's written on a bank envelope. I love that. And that's actually property of Library of Congress. And I did, it's got peanut butter in the recipe. And peanut butter, but see, peanut butter was used a lot in Southern baking because it enriched things, if you think about it. It was very accessible, it was affordable, and it enriched, made something more nutritious. I love that recipe. And she called for feather-light flour. But I believe she capitalized the F, so I thought it's a brand. And sure enough, it was a brand that was in Alabama at the time. That's probably, my mother used to write recipes on bridge tallies. She would play bridge with ladies and they'd talk about food at the table while they were playing cards. And she would come home with recipes on the score sheet for bridge and on cocktail napkins. I don't know, what about you? Have you?
I love the recipes written on the back of envelopes. I spent my childhood every Friday night with my grandparents, and my grandpa Lasseter was always trying to recreate his mother's tea cakes. Every weekend. He was making a batch of tea cakes. They were too hard. They were too soft. I was eating the dough. I was going to get, whatever it is you get when you eat raw eggs. Like, there was all this drama about it. And I don't feel like he ever perfected it, but it was wonderful. And like the ones he made are the tea cakes of my memory. The tea cakes that I will, the tea cakes I make my kids. But when I asked him to write down the recipe, he's like, 1 cup sugar, 1 cup, 1 egg, 1 teaspoon vanilla, and flour to suit. I just spent a whole lot trying to figure out this flour. Like, give me the quantity. But yeah, just sort of that. And I think the recipe he had written down called for oleo, but he decided he was not going to be using oleo in his tea cakes.
And when a recipe calls for oleo, it usually can kind of narrow down the time period of where the recipe came from too. Like, was it post-war, which is when people got used to baking with oleo, even if they liked it or not, you baked with oleo instead of butter. So a lot of the recipes in the late 40s and 50s call for oleo. It's interesting. Yeah.
Other questions?
What do you think about the resurgence of gelatin in Southern recipes? It seems like it's making a little resurgence in some of the recipes that I've seen. Because there was a time period in the 50s and 60s, the space age cookbooks, where everything was shaken. And I've seen gelatin stuff, and that's just blowing my mind.
I think it's a good question, because I don't know what period we're in right now. Is it like because of TikTok, or what has influenced baking? But I promise you, 5-10 years ago, nobody would have been swapping Jell-O recipes, right? And I wrote the Cake Mix Doctor myself, when my kids were little, and I remember that was 25 years ago this December that book was published. And when I went on book tour, oh my gosh, I mean, I was just sharing recipes, family recipes that started with a box of cake mix, and you would have thought I was trying to change the world order. When I got to Minneapolis, New York, whatever, it was not favorable press at all. But that was just the time period. That was 2000. I mean, that's just where we were. People were, and so it's very cyclical, I think, what we're interested in. But Jell-O salads are still a part of Southern culture, and they're still a part of Thanksgiving at our house. We've always got one. So I kind of hate for them to go away.
It's part of it.
Yeah.
Well, She does have a terrific selection
A difference in
of
recipes, yeah.
goodies. So can you tell us what we'll find back there?
I can. There's a couple of Nashville recipes. I think they're on the far left and far right. That is chess cake. My mother's chess cake. We grew up with that. It's like a blondie. But, you know, in Middle Tennessee, we're all about chess pie and chess cake. Chess pie usually has vinegar in it and some cornmeal. We like it almost mountain-like, but not quite, because we're not East Tennessee. We're Middle Tennessee. And so chess cake, I love it. And then on the far right is Mrs. Collins' sweet potato cake, and that is a Nashville recipe. Fabulous cake for the holidays. You cook the sweet potatoes in their jackets, unpeeled, and then when they're tender, pull them out, and you can just run a knife right down it and unzip them, and the sweet potato will fall right out, and you can mash it. There's just no excuse to not cook with fresh sweet potatoes when they're in season. That's a great dessert. And then I brought a little bit of the Memphis chocolate pound cake, which is a unique recipe because you just don't see it across the South. The recipe came out of a 1964 Memphis Exchange cookbook. The Women's Exchange in Memphis is old, 1885, and it was started by women, for women, to help them make money with handiwork, crafts, and also by baking, and that it still exists today off of Poffer. In fact, I had lunch there today, and the tea room, it's still going, it's amazing. And then, let's see, lemon squares, because I think they're so southern. And, a ginger cookie from Virginia. And I call them cemetery ginger cookies because they were what the fundraisers for the old city cemetery in Lynchburg, Virginia would bake to raise money to make the repairs on this very old cemetery where a lot of Civil War veterans are buried. So it's a very historical Virginia recipe, and it's great for baking, for taking like a cookie swap during the holidays.
Well, thank you for joining us and for sharing this.
Thank you.